I am the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I want to talk about where does the will come from, extending Schopenhauer's concept of the will. After Schopenhauer tells us that what underlies reality is the will, and what we see and understand through our sensory and cognitive apparatus are merely representations or appearances. This is why he named his book The World as Will and Representation. I have summarized Schopenhauer's book in another video, which I have linked in the description, so please watch that to get a more complete version of Schopenhauer's theory. My aim here is to talk about where the will could come from. Through a thought experiment about possible worlds, I conclude that the will is merely the conditions underpinning a life-sustaining world, the will to life. Schopenhauer's will is a universal will of which the individual beings in it are subordinate to it. So for Schopenhauer, there are two layers of reality. There is the subjective layer, which is how a person perceives reality, and the objective layer, which is how things really are as the things in themselves. The reason why there is a difference goes back to Immanuel Kant's theory spelled out in his Critique of Pure Reason. Kant explains that what we understand, though received from the world, is processed and filtered through our sensory and cognitive apparatus. We do not have a direct or immediate relation to the world, but a mediated one, the medium of mediation being our sense and cognitive apparatus. For Kant, there is no way to get to the objective side of reality, which he calls noumena. We only have phenomena, which are the representations we understand of the world. Schopenhauer builds on Kant's breakthrough to give us a way out to get to noumena, or at least closer. While we understand what is external to us only in a mediate way, there is something that we do understand in an immediate way, which is ourselves. When we act, the internal feeling of action we have corresponds to what we see our bodies doing. The internal, what we will, and the external, what our bodies do, correspond to each other. This is how we know that there is an inner being, a thing in itself, and then an outer being, which are what others can see of us, which is their representation of us. Not always does that representation of us correspond to our inner beings. Others may think we look happy, but we may be feeling sad inside, for instance. Where does this inner being, this will, which is the I, come from? Schopenhauer's theory is that there is a universal will. We, everything, all living and non-living things, participate in this universal will. Schopenhauer is a monist, which means he thinks that we are all one and are all this universal will. The reason why we see separate things is because of representation. When we view the world, we see things as separate from one another because it is how we make sense of the world through time and space. We see cause and effect, relations between how things affect one another because of the principle of sufficient reason. But this is merely an overlay we put upon things with our cognitive apparatus, because these relations are not in the things in themselves. Instead, the true reality is that everything has a will, which is part of the universal will. So what is this universal will? We are unable to know it entirely because we can never know the things in themselves of other things, but we do know one thing in itself, which is ourselves, because we have an immediate relation to ourselves. So we can recognize our own will. What we can learn about this universal will is what we can deduce from what we know of our own will. What we know of our own will is that it is a will to life, meaning we want to preserve ourselves and we want to reproduce. We want to preserve ourselves so we avoid harm and undertake the activities to sustain ourselves, such as gather food and build a shelter, etc. We want to reproduce because we want to preserve the species we belong to, and reproduction is necessary for such preservation since living things die. We observe this in all living things, death as well as these two characteristics of the will to life, self-preservation and reproduction. The universal will is, however, not concerned with the well-being of individual things, but it is extremely concerned with the species of these things as a whole and all species. Schopenhauer declines to speculate how the universal will came about, as he believes it is beyond our knowledge of things we can possibly know. He writes, "The essence of things before or beyond the world, and consequently beyond the will, is closed to all investigation because cognition in general is itself only phenomenon and therefore takes place only in the world, just as the world takes place only in it. However, I think it is possible to consider how this universal will even came about to begin with. The easiest way for me to express what I want to explain is through a thought experiment, one not understandable in his time, which is the 18th to 19th century, but familiar in ours. Imagine we are simulating a new world on a general programmable system such as a computer. In programming, a programmer has to define everything, including the physical dimensions of the simulated world, the objects within it, and the rules they have to obey. If he does not state that objects obey Newton's laws of mechanics, they will not. Colliding particles will not bounce off each other but pass through each other unless explicitly told otherwise. Hence, nothing can be taken for granted. This simulated world is a tabula rasa, a blank slate, but by blank, it is not just devoid of matter, but devoid even of any rules. There is no gravity, no weak or strong nuclear force, electromagnetic fields, or any such familiar laws of nature. When we introduce objects into it, we have to define what rules we want them to obey. Such an austere yet programmable environment is perfect for thinking through what we take for granted in our universe. One rule can be for things not to persist, to vanish in 1 millisecond. Suppose we introduce a billion such objects by typing some keystrokes and then hitting enter. When we hit enter, our screen fills up, but before we can even hit the spacebar to pause the simulation to examine what we have programmed, the objects have already vanished. So we change the rules. Maybe we keep the 1 millisecond rule for half of the particles and 24 hours for the other half. We leave the laboratory, going home for the evening and come back the next day. We look at the screen. Half the particles have vanished while half remain. We work on something else all day and then go home. We come back the next day. The screen is empty, as if we had not introduced any objects before, as if they had never existed in our simulated universe. We have already learned two things. Lesson 1. To observe something in existence, that thing must persist for some length of time. Lesson 2. For something to remain in existence, it must be able to persist not just for some determinate amount of time, but should persist until a change affects it. We update the rules of this universe to take into account these lessons. For any object which somehow makes its way into this updated universe, it will persist unless destroyed by some other object. We introduce an object here, another over there, sprinkling objects slightly over the two-dimensional surface of the screen, which represents our simulated two-dimensional universe. These objects are analogous to non-living things, motionless and unchanging unless acted upon by external forces. Let's call them NLTs to stand for non-living things. At the moment, there are no external forces in the universe since the programmers have not yet introduced any. There is no wind, no rain, no forces that can erode the NLTs over time, and so they remain untouched and unchanged. We shall call this outcome A. We next introduce objects that can grow and interact with other objects analogous to living things, or LTs. The reason why we call them by letters is to avoid any confusion with actual living or non-living things, though we want to keep the association with real-life things to enable the readers to keep track of what is what. Remember, there are no rules for LTs yet, since all rules that exist in the simulation must be explicitly made by its programmers. Growing and interacting through movement is what differentiates LTs and NLTs. How shall LTs grow and interact? If no new rules are introduced specific to the LTs except their growth and movement, then soon the entire world will be full with LTs growing to massive sizes and pushing the NLTs to the edges of the world or out of it if objects are allowed to fall out of it. If they are allowed to fall out, then soon we will only have one massive LT, which would push all other LTs and NLTs out of the edges of the world. Let's call this outcome B. If, however, we have a rule akin to the conservation of mass and energy, that and the introduction of LTs make the simulations so much more interesting and dynamic. For LTs to carry out the activities of the LTs, that is, grow, sustain their lives and move, they have to consume other objects, be they NLTs or LTs. This consumption enables an LT to grow larger, but movement takes away its energy, which makes it grow smaller if it keeps moving without consuming. So the size of an LT is a proxy for how much energy it has. We notice a problem with our current consumption rule. When two LTs interact with the aim of consumption, they mutually consume each other. However, it is like passing a ball back and forth, resulting in a small decrease, then increase in size for each of the two LTs, taking turns for this increase and decrease. This act of mutual consumption leads to an infinite loop in the program. To solve this problem, we add a rule that larger LTs consume at a faster rate than smaller LTs, and that mutual consumption does not happen at the same time, but they must take turns. Hence, for two LTs of unequal size, the bigger will ultimately completely consume the smaller, and for two LTs of equal size, in the first step of consumption, since they have to take turns, one LT will become marginally larger after the first step of consumption, and that will lead it to then completely consume the other ultimately. In this way, consumption will take some time and is not instantaneous, just like in the real world. To speed things up on the simulation, we make 1 hour of real time equal to 1 decade of sim time. We look upon our creation and we are pleased. We go home for the evening. We arrive back the next day to an empty simulated world again. What happened this time round, we wonder. To find out what happened, we watch the replay. What had elapsed was that the LTs had consumed all the NLTs and other LTs they had interacted with. Finally, 2 LTs were left. These two started consuming each other, but given the proportionate rate of consumption for all the LTs, the smaller one was completely consumed. Left with nothing else to consume, the remaining LT continued moving around the empty world, using up its energy and hence becoming slowly smaller and smaller, finally vanishing altogether. Under the rules we have up to this point, the world will face complete extinction of its objects. This is outcome C. To avoid getting such a blank slate, we introduce reproduction. When two LTs interact, they can consume each other or they can copulate and together produce 1 to 5 child LTs. However, these child LTs are small, meaning they have little energy to find food through movement. To help them survive, we set a protection rule that until a decade of sim time has passed, these child LTs can only consume other adult LTs and NLTs they meet, but not other child LTs, and adult LTs cannot consume or copulate with them. To copulate, LTs have to have grown to a certain size because it takes energy to copulate, which will reduce their size. It takes a decade for child LTs to reach that threshold size. While these rules may seem to be many compared to the previous simple rule setting, the programmers have come to adopt these rules through a process of discovery and refinement because missing out on any of them leads to extinction. For instance, if no ban on the consumption of child LTs is put in place, the adult LTs can copulate, reproduce, and shortly consume their product, grow in size, and keep repeating this until they are so large, and then we get outcome B. Reproduction will have no effect to sustain this world, since a child LT will not be able to find a smaller LT to consume. Without consumption, it will perish either through being eaten by adult LTs or by expending all its energy through fruitless movement. Because of the many variations in a world with reproduction, instead of running just one simulation on one computer the way the programmers had been doing, we now run multiple simulations at the same time over multiple computers. In sum, everything vanishes including the NLTs. The NLTs are a limited resource and without a means of reproduction gets consumed and are lost forever to the simulation. As for the LTs, they reproduce in aggregate at a rate slower than their rate of death, leading finally to their extinction. This is outcome D. However, some of the simulated worlds continue to support life over a long runtime, with there being at least some LTs continuing to exist in them. Let's call this set of worlds Conti, standing for continuing. Imagine everybody in the laboratory going home one evening, and then a pandemic hits in the real world. A lockdown order is issued with everyone not allowed to leave their homes, except for essential tasks like buying food and water. The programmers are only allowed back into their laboratory after a year has passed because the pandemic was resolved. We come in happy to be back. After some high fives and hugs, we settle down with our coffees and look at the various simulations that had continued running in the time we were away. Recall that an hour of real time is a decade of sim time. A year of real time has passed, which equates to 87,600 years in the simulations. There are some quantities remaining. What does this tell us? If there were no rules whatsoever and no living things, we will have an empty or static world of non-living things which persist and remain unchanged. If living things are then introduced into this world with a need to consume and a propensity to move, we have several possible outcomes. If they are unable to reproduce, they will ultimately go extinct. If they can reproduce, it opens up a range of possible outcomes, such as some worlds will see extinction of all things, while some worlds will see living things persist over a long time. These worlds have a balance of resources versus the consumption of the living things. The number of living things is kept in check by their aggregate birth and death rates, allowing for the continuation of life in that world. I've called these sets of worlds Conti. What can we conclude? For a world that is sufficiently old, its age counting from when life on it began, and which continues to have life, several rules seem to be needed. 1. Objects persist, ceteris paribus. 2. Larger LTs eat smaller LTs. The real-world analog is how big fishes eat small fishes. 3. The principle of conservation of mass. 4. The principle of conservation of energy. 5. Reproduction. 6. Until the child LT has reached maturity, it is protected. Rule 2 and its inverse is a law of consumption, which works out to be a law of self-preservation. It really is an extension of Rule 1, except for living things. Rule 5 and 6 are the laws of reproduction. Rule 3 and 4 are laws of conservation, where the amount of matter and energy in this universe is fixed and no more can be created, since where would it come from? In our nuclear age, they are generalizable to one rule, the principle of conservation of mass energy. Back to our programmers who returned to the laboratory a year later after the pandemic. We come back to some simulations which are devoid of life, and some which still have life and are likely to continue having life, since this life has already persisted through 87 millennia. How does this relate to our real world? The fact that we see life around us in an old world suggests that the simple rules devised in the simulations apply. The background rules of conservation apply to the background conditions of our universe, while the principles of self-preservation and reproduction apply to living things. Schopenhauer proposes that these two principles are characteristic of the will to life, which are universal across all living things. My aim with the thought experiment is to demonstrate that this will, with these two characteristics, can be the result not of an omnipotent divine designer, but as a natural logical consequence in a universe that is sufficiently old and that still has life. Without self-preservation and reproduction, life would have gone extinct in both the simulations and the real world. I have used the analogy of computer simulation to bring out this conclusion on how the will does not require a designer to possess these two characteristics. I want to address two potential objections. The first is minor. Not all individual living things reproduce nor preserve their lives, both in the real world and in the simulation. In both, those who do not die out. If the rate of these individuals being born exceed the rate of birth of other individuals who self-preserve and reproduce, the populations of LTs will shrink over time. As long as the tendency in the population on aggregate to self-preserve and reproduce is stronger than the opposite tendency, extinction is more likely not to happen. The second is more difficult to address. My thought experiment involves programmers who create the simulations, setting its rules and populating its initial conditions, in addition to maintaining the operational requirements to keep the simulations running, such as supplying the computers with electricity. We must note that my programmers are not analogous to a divine designer, but are more like people who throw a bunch of things at the wall and see what sticks. They are trying out a range of conditions to see which conditions yield continued life, very different from a supposedly omnipotent God who in his wisdom created, no trial and error involved, the precise conditions required to support life. The programmers are more akin to observers who come to an aquarium where one tank has only rocks and sand, the second only male fish, and the third a mix of male and female fish. The fishes are not supplied with food and hence eat one another for survival. If left alone over time, the first tank never develops life, the second sees extinction, while the third may be able to see life persisting. The observers observe this and conclude that for life to persist, self-preservation in the forms of fishes eating one another and reproduction is required. If either condition is not possible for the fishes on the whole, then life will not persist. So if life persists over time, these conditions of self-preservation and reproduction are necessary, according to the former logical rule of replacement called contraposition or transposition. Schopenhauer in his 2-volume work, The Will as Will and Representation, does not spell out where the will comes from. However, he believes that the will exists as a result of its own inner force and through itself, not as a matter of divine creation but simply a matter of its own development. The results of my thought experiment shows how the two characteristics of Schopenhauer's will can come about for an old world that has life in it, though it presupposes the existence of matter and living things, leaving the explanation of how these come into existence to empirical science. My essay also amplifies the concept latent in Schopenhauer's works, that the will is nothing more than the necessary conditions for life to continue in this world. It is not some kind of mysterious or divine force, but instead is merely the logical answer to the question, for life as a whole to persist, what is required of the world? Through a thought experiment about possible worlds, we can conclude that the will is merely the conditions underpinning a life-sustaining world, the will to life. There are other worlds which do not have life, and the will in those worlds lack the conditions that sustain life, but have the remaining conditions of the will to life. Since we live in a world that is life-sustaining, we are part of the will to life which drives us to continue to sustain life, but we can also deny this will, since the specific conditions to sustain life are not ineluctable, in line with Schopenhauer's doctrine of first recognizing the will to life and then denying it to achieve salvation from suffering. Thank you.